Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Arboricultural Association headquarters here in Stonehouse in the UK. My name's John Parker, and I'm Technical Director at the Association and your host for this evening. It's just a nice short introduction for you from me this week, as this is part 2 of our 3-part lecture series, An Ecosystem Approach to Urban Forestry with Rob Northrop and Michael Andreu. And they will explain everything you need to know in just a moment. As ever, I'd invite you all to use the chat to introduce yourselves and join in with the discussion, but please remember to select all panelists and attendees. And if you have any specific questions rather than comments, then please use the Q&A button so that it's a bit easier for me to keep track of what's going on. Next Wednesday is the final part in this lecture series, and you can register free for that on our online learning page if you haven't already done so. However, if one dose of Rob Northrop per week is simply not enough for you, and let's face it, who is it enough for? Fear not, because next week we've got something special in store. On Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock UK time, the Arboricultural Association is very pleased to be co-hosting a webinar which is being presented by the University of Florida, specifically Rob and Deborah Hilbert. Some of you might have seen Deborah appear as a panelist on an episode of Arborist Question Time, where she mentions some of the research which will be explored in this webinar, the subject of which is designing urban rights of way to prevent damage from tree roots. This is an issue experienced by arboriculturalists and urban foresters all over the world, and thanks to the University of Florida, you'll get to learn all about it next Tuesday at 6 p.m. and you can register for that as well through our online learning page. So, okay, let's get to it. It's my very great pleasure to welcome back Rob and Michael to the virtual stage. Gents, it's over to you, and I'm going to hide myself. Take it away, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's wonderful to see all the places that people are from in the chat. My name is Rob Northrop. I'm an extension forester with the University of Florida. First, we want to say thank you to the Arboricultural Association of the UK for hosting this webinar series, the whole thing, not just the 3 programs that Michael and I are doing with you, but for all of us, for all of the programs, for providing the opportunity to share, to have a conversation, to exchange ideas. Urban forestry is a new discipline, maybe not even quite a discipline yet, and it has come about as we've entered into the emergence of the Anthropocene epoch. So it's really new, and we're really just now trying to figure out what it means and how we might apply the ecological principles that we understand from science to better manage and protect and restore urban and urbanizing forests. One of the things we want to say is that we will say we a lot. We did this, or we did that. And it's not just Michael and I, although we certainly have participated in much of what we'll talk about to a large degree. But I do want to mention the other people, Kathy Beck, who 40 years experience as a municipal arborist with the City of Tampa, Ross Dickerson, who is the Director of Management for a 32,000 hectare system of rare, threatened, and endangered species habitat in Hillsborough County, where we work a lot. Sean Landry, who is an absolute genius of a geographer and just a top-notch GIS technical expert. Wayne Zipper, a forest researcher with the USDA Forest Service with us. We work a lot with him. He's stationed in Gainesville near the University of Florida. And last but not least is the newest member of our small part of our collaboration is Andrew Kozer, who's a research arborist. Michael?
Yeah, and my name is Michael Andreu. I'm a associate professor at the University of Florida School of Forest Resources and Conservation. And I just want to echo again what Rob said, and thanks for having this opportunity to speak with all of you. I really enjoyed our experience last week and look forward to continuing that conversation. So it's a great team that we work with, and so it's fun to share some of this work with you all, and I look forward to what we're going to be doing today as well.
So we're gonna provide you with an overview right away of a contemporary ecological perspective on ecosystems, kind of a definition, if you will, to make sure that we recognize the terms that we're using. Okay, and really we want this to be a sharing. We see this as a way of taking our experience and sharing with other people, and we hope in the end that this leads to collaborations, to conversations that go far beyond the borders of where Michael and I spend most of our time working. So I'm going to start with what I do know, and which is the United States and Florida and the work we're doing, and take a look at the roots of modern conservation, at least from the United States, starting in about 1850 through the present. Most of conservation had to do with the protection of species, and those species that were protected were based upon the perception of beauty, rarity, or some type of charisma. We also had a real focus on the preservation of landscapes. That's where our national parks came from, really, was initially trying to preserve landscapes, okay? And we also had a focus on climax species, or species that we thought had reached the point where they were in a steady state and they didn't change, okay? You'll notice that these three pillars of modern conservation in the United States do not include an ecological perspective on ecosystems. They look at these different pillars more as things or objects. So a traditional paradigm or perspective, if you will, on ecosystems was that they were closed, that they had boundaries around them, and that those boundaries were fairly inviolate, and that even if you poke them, they would readjust. What we know today is that those boundaries are pervious. Okay, there are boundaries that we can delineate around ecosystems or communities, if you will, but they're not closed, they're open. Energy, nutrients, animals, people, plants, all move across these boundaries. We also know that when you poke the boundaries of ecosystems or change the ecosystem dynamics a little bit, that they do not self-regulate, okay? They do not self-regulate, and in fact, ecosystems can be regulated externally. A good example is here where we work a lot is the Tampa Bay itself. It's an estuary. Tampa Bay estuaries had some problems, like a lot of estuaries that we're familiar with nitrification, nitrogen, phosphorus getting in the water, causing algal blooms, reducing the amount of oxygen in the water, getting fish kills. We've heard this many times before. So the big emphasis was on stopping the phosphorus and the nitrogen coming off the land into the bay, into Tampa Bay. But after further research, what we found out was that 45% of the nitrogen doesn't even come from off the land, it comes from the atmosphere. It is pulled out of the atmosphere in the rain, and that the nitrogen itself in the atmosphere, most of it is coming from the Midwestern part of the United States. So here we have a big ecological system, the Tampa Bay, that's being regulated by an atmospheric environment coming from 1,000 miles away. Also, in the past, because we looked at things, we focused on climax, or what we thought were steady state conditions, the whole idea of the balance of nature. The reason that happened was because researchers, when they wanted to study the forest, they didn't study it in and around the city. They went out to more remote areas and looked at how the forest operated out there. And they took those science that they had, created generalized models, and brought them back for us all to use. But those generalized models were really looking at sites that had long periods of not being disturbed, and they appeared to be in some form of a climax condition. Also, it was thought that when you disturbed an ecological system, like a forest, that it would, through self-regulation, predictably move in a linear fashion to going back to that steady state over time. In other words, it would reorganize itself completely and you would get that same system back. It might be a long time, but you would get that same system back. This simply disregarded the fact that the plants, animals that we see on the site are reflective not only of the geology and history, the soils and the climate, but also the history of the area. What seeds were available? When were they available? Could they get there and germinate and get established? In what sequence did it happen? How did the structure and the composition change over time to allow different animals to move in and to find what they needed to survive? Another pillar of the traditional paradigm of an ecological perspective of ecosystems was that disturbed states were exceptional. Again, we had researchers going out far away from cities and looking at picking spots that fit their definition of what a climax was. We now know that disturbance is a natural phenomenon. Watch that word natural. We won't go there right now, but anybody got a good definition of natural, give it to us at the Q&A session. We'd like to hear that one. But disturbance is part of how ecosystems function, okay? Disturbance is a part of it. And in fact, there are some ecological systems in which disturbance is absolutely necessary to maintain or to have the great diversity of plants and animals that exist in that system. Our own longleaf pine system here in Florida is just like that. It's dependent upon the disturbance of fire. And finally, the last thing, because they went out far away from any type of human activity, was that ecosystems were not, people were not components of the ecosystems themselves. And of course, that's totally not in keeping at all with how we understand the dynamics of the Earth's systems today. People are very much as any other animal, any other plant, a part of the system. So what does this tell us in terms of urban forest management? Well, what it tells us is that what we're really interested in, should be focusing on, are the relationships that exist between plants, animals. We should be looking at processes, disturbance, dispersal, establishment, competition, and growth. We should be looking at these dynamics of the ecosystem and not looking at just things as objects, okay? The tree, and this is the beautiful part about what Dave Nowak has given us, right, through all these iTree models and things, is that we now begin to see relationships between the condition of the air and the trees that we have, or the condition of the water and the trees and shrubs that we have. And through other research, we now begin to see the relationship between the vegetation, all of the vegetation, and the health of human society. We also have to look at the other thing besides process and these relationships is context. Because now we know that the boundaries of the ecosystems, in this case, maybe a city or municipal boundary, is permeable and it's not closed. And what you do inside the city affects what happens outside the city. And what you do outside the city also affects what happens inside the city in terms of these ecological systems. So the spatial connections, and all very important. So it also shifts conservation away from that mindset of strictly hands-off. Those 32,000 hectares of rare, threatened, and endangered species habitat in Hillsborough County, at one point, they put fences around them, and they thought they had protected them. They didn't call them natural areas, they called them protected areas. That's the way, and that's the way we used to look at things from that old paradigm. But today we recognize that by putting a fence around something doesn't protect it, because that system is open and available to be influenced and influence what is around it. And so it shifts our attention away from just the objects that we're looking at to the ecological processes, to the relationships. And it shifts our attention away from just what we're looking at to how it is connected over much bigger scales, geographic scales. And that's why last time we got together, we talked about that it's not just the city trees that we're talking about in urban forestry. We're talking about whole metropolitan regions now. Michael, I'm going to let it go there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty complex concept that you're introducing. And again, we're talking about the idea of an ecosystem approach to managing urban forests. And so, first off, we need to, think about what is a system, and systems are composed of components, right? And so, in the case of biology, we think of the cell as the individual system, and it, has all those features that you talked about an individual system having. And then a collection of cells coming together is the tissue, and the collection of tissues are create an organism. And so these systems exist at different scales. And so when we begin to think about an ecosystem, an urban ecosystem, we got to recognize that there are multiple scales by which they exist. There's the individual tree that's in somebody's backyard. That is one scale of urban forestry and urban forest management. There's the collection of trees along a street and in a neighborhood, and that's certainly another scale to think about. There's the parks and those natural areas that you discussed within the urban matrix, and that's another scale of thinking about these urban forests. And then there's these urbanizing areas, these areas that are on the edges, as you can sort of see here, that are going to be urbanized and soon. And certainly then we have those broader natural areas, or as many in Florida really look at them and say, those yet to be developed areas. So there's a whole lot going on in terms of the complexity. And we've got to be able to think about managing, zooming in and managing at fine scales, and zooming out and managing at broad scales. And that's going to be a very important concept to think about. You add to that complexity of geographic complexity, other aspects, jurisdictional complexity, the ownership, who owns it? Is it publicly owned or is it privately owned? And even there's complexity, whether the types of agencies and their mandates that they have in terms of ownership, or the type of private ownership, whether it's an individual or corporate ownership. And so again, there's levels of complexity that make this increasingly more difficult to think about. And then you wrap all that within the element of time, and thinking about how things are changing, how these ecosystems are changing. So we've got, as we begin to think about managing these ecosystems and these urban ecosystems, we've got to think about not just managing them for today, but how they're changing over time. That constant dynamic that you referred to, Rob. You start to add all these pieces in, and it really gets overwhelming. It can sort of, make you shut down. So one of the things we want to talk about here is one of the first steps that we think is important is to recognize that whether we're an arborist or whether we're a regional planner, regardless of what our scale or where we operate in, these kinds to take on urban, ecosystem approach to urban forestry, you're not going to be able to do this alone. The importance and value of collaboration is incredible, and we're going to only be able to approach these kinds of problems by integrating with multiple people, multiple institutions, and making sure we're involving science to ensure that we're getting to that sustainable management. And we talked about that as we in Tampa, our first step as we began to look at the Tampa Bay area and think about it at these different scales, was not to try to do all of this alone. We began to bring people together into a conversation. and we created the Tampa Bay Watershed Forest Working Group. And if you remember, Rob, when we started out, we invited everybody. We just sort of wrote out a broad list of people that we knew were involved with the management of the forest at various scales, from the arborist and the people that are involved at the individual street tree level working, to those regional planners and the agency people and the NGOs. We tried to really just open that invitation up to everybody and to invite them in.
We wanted to open up the conversation, and we didn't want to move into this with assumptions.
Right.
We wanted to get the broad picture from as many diverse perspectives as possible.
And if you remember, some of those early conversations, they were awkward sometimes. People looked at us like, what are you trying to do here? And it was stilted sometimes. And so we had to sort of keep reintroducing this idea of let's understand this forest. How can we collectively begin to understand this forest, and why do we want to understand this forest? And over time, that conversation evolved. And it evolved with people dropping in at times and people dropping out. And we didn't worry too much about who was there, as long as we were continuing to meet and people were coming back to have this conversation. And what we saw is that, not everybody came back to the table. So people, for a variety of reasons, didn't come back to that conversation, but we began to build a core group of people that came back to the conversation. You want to add something to that, Rob?
Yeah, it has to do with one of the questions we got that we didn't get to answer last week.
Yeah.
And that is, how do you get people to work together, even conservation groups who have disparate interests and seem to compete with each other for things? And what we were able to do through this consensus process was to go through a critical thinking system with all these people to get it down to what was the core problem that we were facing. And by doing that, we got everyone to agree that there were these 4 things that we really had to do to get anything done. Nobody could get anything done because these 4 things had to get done. And by doing that, when Michael and I have continued with that 4 goals for the last 15 years, is that every once in a while, when the particular interest of an NGO or a government aligns with what's going on, they come back in. So it's not as awkward as it sounds, really. It's just that when you have a collaboration, both participants, or however many participants you have, they have to be getting something and giving something. They have to be achieving something also. So that's the way that group worked, and it still works today.
And if you want to see those four things that he just described, we actually posted those in our last slideshow from the previous week. So you can look at how that evolved and some of those goals that we set up for ourselves. But that really became the place by which we could learn from others, and we could share with others. And it really builds that conversation. And that, to me, is at the core of this. And it's much like what this whole group and this webinar series is about. It's building these relationships and connections and learning from others that with different perspectives. And I think that's the first sort of really important lesson when we try to address these very complex or wicked problems, as people refer to them. The other thing to think about is that, when we talk about this ecosystem approach to urban forestry, a lot of times people feel like, well, that's not me. I work at a very small scale, and I don't fit into these big picture discussions. And I think that's really important to recognize the value of the individual, regardless of what scale they work at, as being part of this conversation, and and that they recognize that these conversations provide a context for their actions, regardless of which scale they're working at. And I think that's a really important piece to think about as well. Do you want to add anything to that, Rob?
No, we've talked about this before. When even if you're working for the city parks and your job is planting trees, you get to have some say about perhaps what species of tree is planted, and that species of tree may or may not support native birds, which is the primary form of wildlife that people enjoy besides squirrels around here in parks in urban areas. And so your choice of species then becomes really, really important and is connected perhaps to the avian population, which is then connected to the insect population and its management, but also those birds fly in and out of the area that you work in. So just recognizing that the individual things that we do are connected. It's that whole idea that there are infinite numbers of relationships between all of the actions and all of the outcomes that we pursue.
I think that's a pretty profound concept to think about and to recognize. So let's sort of switch gears from that and that idea of collaboration. That's a foundational piece to all of this. I think the next idea is this idea of management and what management is. How do we manage things? Management is often sort of defined or perceived at least as doing stuff, getting stuff done. And I know as a manager, my perspective is that I want to get things done. I want to take action. I want to demonstrate that I have value. I'm doing things. And the reality is that when we're as managers, we never have enough information. We never have enough time. We never have enough money and resources to get that job done. But we've got to do that. So what is the core? What is management? How do we do it? How do we do things? Well, management, as I define it, is really about predicting the future. Okay, it's determining how any action that you take is going to create or affect a response, and it's also defining what that response is. So I think it's really important to recognize that that we as managers are attempting to do what is impossible to do, to predict the future. And yet we've got to try to do that and fill in those gaps of information that we don't have. So the other piece of management implies that there's a time element to it. You're at time one and you're predicting the future, so you're moving through time. So this is really, really difficult to do, right? Predicting the future. So to predict the future, if we're going to do that with any sort of success, we've got to have a strong understanding of where we are today. All right. And so in the case of urban forestry, if we're going to attempt to do ecosystem management, if we're going to attempt to affect some change, we got to have some understanding of where you are today. So that's the first step. And so to do that, we talked about in Tampa, our approach was to do an inventory, to do an assessment of the forest. And so beginning to develop an inventory opens you up to a host of questions. And I'm not going to go in this discussion today about all the approaches to different inventory methods, whether it's the actual methodology or the establishment of the inventories. That's a whole different discussion. But what I will say is that there are a lot of questions that you got to ask. At what scale do you want to be doing your measurements? What is it exactly you're trying to measure, and how do you go about measuring it? So those are all questions you're going to need to ask and to develop answers for. And what's really important to this is the answers will vary depending on who is asking those questions. And often when we're doing these and when we're setting out to do these, it's us, the experts, the forestry people, the urban foresters, arborists. We're the ones that are creating and asking those questions and developing those and making those decisions on the inventory process. And that's part of the problem. And that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit more later in this discussion today. All right. So when we started out in Tampa, the discussions at that point in time, the assessments of the forest had primarily been focused on defining the canopy cover, where that forest was and how that cover was distributed across a given area. And this is a real common metric, and we see this a lot, is that canopy cover is used. It's good because it's fairly easy to measure, it's very repeatable, and you can explain it pretty easily to people. And so that's a common metric, and it's widely used, and certainly was in our area. But what we found and what we think is that there's flaws with that metric, and while it's widely used, there's a lot of things that are missing from that metric. Certainly, it does not reflect the various species out there. It's very difficult to make any distinction from the different species you find in, by just looking at aerial photography. It doesn't give you any indication of that. And why is that important? Certainly, again, as Rob talked about, the value and the importance of all these interconnections as to what tree you might select to plant. If we don't have any understanding of the diversity of the forest, the different species that are out there, we won't be able to understand all those connections and begin to manage at this ecosystem scale. Also thinking about the issue of invasive species and that may be coming in. You don't get any of those kinds of understandings from metrics such as canopy cover. It doesn't tell us anything about the size classes and how these things are distributed around the landscape. It doesn't tell us about the health of the forest. And health is really important. I mean, we can manage and have lots of tree canopy cover, but if we have an unhealthy forest, that's not going to really achieve these things that we say we want from our forest. So we really need to have assessments that give us a lot more information like this. And the other thing about doing assessments that involve a ground-based approach, which is what we ended up doing, installing plots at the ground level, is that we can describe the forest not only to ourselves as scientists and as land managers and as urban forest managers, but we can describe it in a way that people experience it. The layperson may experience it. We can give them that level of information. So that was our approach, was to really think about how can we describe the urban forest in a way that people can understand. And we established a system of permanent plots so that not only were we describing the forest at its different areas, and you can see in this slide, all the different ways it appears out there on the landscape, but we could also come back to those areas and remeasure them and be able to think about how they change over time. And that's that important aspect of management, being able to not just get a snapshot of where you are, which is important for establishing a baseline, but then be able to see how things are changing, that dynamic nature of these systems that Rob talked about. The really nice thing about all this data, and this is something I think we touched on last time, and I'll just touch on this briefly, is that not only could we then take this data and describe the forest to the managers and to the decision makers in the area and to the public, but we could also use models to describe not just the objects themselves, the trees and what was out there, but we could also describe their functionality. And that's, I think many of you all are aware of the models that have been developed by Nowak and his team. And it started out, when we started out, it was called U4, now it's called iTree. And those models, and there's a lot of other models that have been coming in now to describe these functions of the forest. And that is really invaluable to being able to have discussions with people. It changes how we talk about the forest, and it allows us to talk about not just what's out there and what condition it's in, but what it's doing, quote unquote, what it is doing. And that, having that understanding is a huge shift for people to be able to ask a whole bunch of new questions. And they can move from sort of asking, and this is often what people want, they just want a number, how much do we need out there? How many trees do we need to plant? How much canopy cover is the right amount of canopy cover? And we can really shift those questions to, what do we want from the forest? What services do we desire? And it opens us up to a whole lot more management options to think about. And so it's at that point in time that we can actually start the conversation about a plan, about thinking about managing for some future condition. So the planning is the last piece of this puzzle that I wanted to sort of talk about. And planning is something that I know as managers, you know, we roll our eyes, oh my gosh, planning. The idea of sitting down to develop a plan is often sort of, you know, something that we don't like to do, because too often our experience, at least I would say in my experience has been, is that you develop a plan, you have this thing set out in front of you, and then you start to implement the plan, you immediately deviate from the plan, and so then the plan ends up getting put on a shelf and not utilized. And so it feels like planning often is a waste of time and effort. And certainly in urban forestry, we've been developing a lot of management plans for a long time, and we've sort of seen this happen. So why don't they work out? Why is this, you know, do these plans not really end up working? Well, if we go back and think about what goes into a plan really has to answer three major questions. What do you got? What do you want? And how are you going to get there? Okay, so those are sort of the three core questions at the crux of a plan. All right, so you know, what do you got? Well, we've already talked about that. That's the foundational piece where you need to establish some kind of inventory to understand what you have out there. And when we have historically done urban forestry, we historically have focused that question on the biophysical landscape, whether it's understanding the collection of trees in somebody's yard, or the street trees in a city, or understanding the entire you know, set of trees within a, you know, some ecological boundary. We focused on the trees. We focused on that component of the system. And so that's because that's where we understand. That's what science has sort of trained us to do. The second part of that is to ask the question, well, what do you want? Well, when we think about that question, what do you want? Again, as managers, as scientists, of these forests, people who study these things, we focused on the metrics of things like, I want X% canopy cover out there. And those targets are often established by the experts. And so that's how we've developed these plans in the past. These targets are often action-based. I'm going to go out and I'm going to plant 10,000 trees over the next 5 years, versus outcome-based, you know, something where we might have all the trees and shrubs are suitable to the physical urban environment and adapted to the regional climate. So we often just have these very action-based plans. And again, if we start to deviate, we think it's not. And again, these targets, these goals, these measurable criteria are often established just by the experts alone. So this is what, you know, we think we've advanced in urban forestry because we've thought about the ecosystem. We think about measuring all these elements and components of the ecosystem and in greater detail than perhaps once we've done. But yet when we build these plans, we often find that these plans continue to fail. And that's the question. Why? Why is our planning process failing us? You can go to that last slide, Rob. And I think this is what is at the core of what is the problem with sort of our sort of normal approach to managing urban forests, is that these, as I told you, or as I explained, these plans have been developed by the experts, the people that are within the field, and then they lead to conflict down the road. And why is that? Is that because we have failed to include in that process of thinking about the ecosystem, we've only thought about the biophysical aspects of it and not the social landscape. And so I think that's something that we want to talk about more. So Rob, you going to pick that up?
Yeah, and this, of course, this goes right back to the reason why I mentioned the the ecological perspective on ecosystems is that in many cases, so many of us are still operating with that traditional paradigm in which humans were not included in thinking about the living world or even the biophysical world, and also often are couched in terms of a great disturbance to the ecological systems, that we are disturbers, and that disturbance has a negative connotation also. And that's why it's important to remember that, you know, those types of perspectives, the balance of nature, disturbance as being bad in and of itself, and people as being perpetuators of the bad disturbance are not good. Those things have no place in modern science. That is not science-based management. Michael brings up the fact that, you know, we've seen so much failure because we have not paid attention. We have not paid attention to the fact that conservation is primarily a social endeavor, and that science and technology is the suite of tools that we have for etching out on the landscape the values that society has. And as long as we keep doing that, we're going to keep failing. And so, you know, when we do not include people, we do not include those values, those perspectives, those attitudes of people, it leads to great uncertainty. If we think about the government structure that we have in the US, the political body itself is put in place based upon and reflecting the values of the people, not science, the values of the people. And they are the decision makers, at least in the public realm. And we're talking about urban systems, and in urban systems, there is a greater preponderance of publicly owned land or publicly controlled land or managed land, okay? So when we leave the social landscape out, it leads to uncertainty. And uncertainty leads to conflict. And then conflict agitates that uncertainty and creates more uncertainty. And so you wind up with this vicious cycle of people feeling insecure and unable to be assured of actually being able to get what they think is needed. And so you get conflict rather than cooperation, rather than collaboration. So how do we go about doing this? When the first thing is to realize, you know, that we can't sit here and tell you how to conduct social surveys, inventories, any more than we have the time right now to discuss the pros and cons of the design and the implementation of biophysical surveys. But what we can tell you is that the social landscape is needed, absolutely needed, as much in urban areas or even more than the biophysical for communication about the purpose of making better management decisions. I also want to bring this up to you, that whole idea of communication, because for us as the managers, right, we find ourselves in the position, as somebody asked last week, what happens when you do a social survey and it comes back and nobody wants trees, right? Nobody wants them. What am I going to do? Well, you've got a bit of good information there that's telling you that you need to get out and talk to people, you know, and you need to communicate. What we as arborists, foresters, scientists, planners, whatever, landscape architects need to do a better job of is communication, okay? And we need to begin to understand the psychology of communication also. This simple little diagram that you have here is representing the fact, for instance, that as a person, my ability to sense what's around me is huge. I have a huge ability to sense sound, smell, see things, hear things, touch things, okay? And my ability to store information over the long term is also huge. But when I take what I grab out of my sensory perception and try and move it into the long-term part and usable part of my memory to make decisions and to solve problems, I can only pull 3 or 4 little chunks in at a time. And so when we communicate with people, we can't bombard them with tons and tons of information that they have no way of connecting and relating to. I just show you this because this is some part of communication theory. And we, as arborists and foresters and scientists and planners, don't normally think about that as part of our job, as understanding that. But we need to try better to understand that. When we talk to people, they're not empty vessels that are just waiting for us to dump everything into. Also with communication, one last thing with communication. This is a photograph. Steffi Graf is the woman's name. It's one of my favorite photographs of my whole life. And this is this young man's name is Michael. I don't know what you get out of this photograph, but what I get out of it is it's a great piece of communication of the relationship between Michael and the turtle, and the fact that he's doing that in Gwens Falls Forest in the middle of Baltimore. When we communicate, don't forget that the great communicators among us tend not to be the scientists, but tend to be the artists, the photographers, the painters, the musicians, the writers. Include them in everything that you do also as you begin to address the emerging urban forest in your metropolitan region and communicating ideas, feelings, and values. And images like this go much, much further at connecting people to each other and connecting them to nature than any of the data that we will ever have. So, sources of information about the social landscape. I mentioned the last time we got together that Michael and I never try and do this alone. And I guess that's the thing I told Michael one day. I said, I thought we start out this webinar series was with, don't try and do this alone. Don't try, you know, but really you need a collaborative effort, but especially with the social part of it. For most of us on here, I don't know that any social scientists or practitioners are on the webinar today. Most of us have a biophysical twist, okay? And we need the help with using social science. So we keep it in science. We keep it locked into being able to defend what we provide to people to make decisions, but use social science to begin to describe the area, the urban area, the metropolitan area that we're working in. And a lot of that information is available to you already. You don't need to do the surveys and all. It depends on the problem, the project that you're interested in. The first thing I'd say, of course, for people who are managing urban forests is to look at the census data. It tells you how many people live there. It tells you their cultures, their ethnic backgrounds. It tells you their income and their distributions. It tells you their age distributions. It tells you what their education distributions are. All of which inform you in terms of who your audience, if you will, the people that you're trying to help are. There are other documents also. For instance, the one up in your upper right-hand corner, that's the planning districts in Tampa. They were built at different times, so they have different types of land patterns. But they also, because of the way people distribute themselves, the newer portions tend to have more people who are more affluent, the older portions, and so on. The map on the lower left-hand screen is a map of census districts that give you much more focused information about who the population of people are in particular neighborhoods or communities that you're going to be working with. And then finally, if you've got a project or a problem that you're trying to solve that is truly unique and is focused in a specific area, you can carry on your own types of social inventories. For instance, in in the city of Tampa, the way we began to describe the social landscape was we looked at the census data, got a broad sense of who we were dealing with, okay? Then we looked at, we did surveys, online surveys of residents' attitudes and perceptions and values, okay? Then we did a thing where we looked at contingent values for the people in the city, saying, well, how much would you pay for this or that, to plant the trees or to keep the trees or to expand the park systems? Then we actually looked at whole neighborhoods and how they would react to those same types of questions. And we began to better understand who it was that we were trying to work for, to address the things that they thought were important. And then we could begin to see, okay, we've got the biophysical data, now we've got the social data, and we can begin to see how they come together. The other part of this picture in terms of the social landscape is not to forget that we are part of that social landscape also. And that what we have learned in the past by trying to implement an ecosystem approach to forests and forestry was that the groups that were the slowest to recognize the value of looking at things from an ecological, contemporary ecological perspective tended to be the professionals themselves and the institutions. And so when we do social surveys, Michael and I do social surveys, we immediately turn right around to the institutions and to the professions and do small, what we call a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So we can see how the institution and how the professions are feeling about urban forestry. And then we take the information we get from the citizens and we match that up to what we get from the institutions and the professions, and we see if there are any disconnects. And that's where we, as professionals, have to recognize that it is our part, most of the time, to make corrections in what we're doing, because we're working within that social context. And of course, if we recognize real problems in social perspectives, ecological perspectives, we can use and participate in education and communication. So what we find then in terms of the social dialogue, the social landscape, is that it's unending. Just as with the biophysical, we need to see how it changes over time and to understand relationships. We need to also continue to look at the social landscape, see how it is changing over time, and seeing how the relationships between different groups are changing, the relationships between those groups and the biophysical landscape is changing also. So it's an unending process. So it's not the way we've done it in the past where we have a project or a plan to write, so we go out and we do a one-off social survey, or we do a one-off public meeting. You know, we get a public meeting before it starts and a public meeting in the end to show it to them. It's actually looking at incorporating people into the collaborative themselves so that they become a part of the collaborative process. And it is up to us as the professionals to provide some leadership and to not sit in the back of the bus, not simply be taken and then dropped off, and continue to address the urban forest and urbanization as a series of problems we need to solve. We need to begin to look at it as the opportunity to rehabilitate the forest to the extent that we possibly can, to create the desirable outcomes that allow for the proliferation of the services and the goods that the forest can provide. And how we do that, Michael and I are suggesting to you, is through the process of ecological science. And that ecological science, as we mentioned earlier, recognizes that there is a human context. So I want to take you through a little cycle here. As Michael said, this can be complex, and with complex problems, we need touchstones, something that we can go back to, something that we can find to give us some firm footing. And what we're suggesting to you today is that firm footing, that firm footing can be found in those contemporary ecological perspectives that we showed you at the beginning of the program. This is one framework for beginning to look at a management system that has an ecological base. We often think of this framework as an adaptive management strategy, a cycle of management that takes a scientific approach. And I want you to look at the highlighted area first. This is the way we would have done it in the past. We would have identified the problem, right? We would have looked at it, did some critical thinking from a biophysical standpoint. We would have established what we wanted as experts. Then we would have gone about designing some type of inventory, and we would have collected the data. We would have synthesized it. We would have evaluated it. We probably would have met then with either the landowners, if we were working with private landowners, or if we were working with the government, met with the government, help them go through a process of identifying what they needed to do to get those biophysical outcomes that they were interested in. We would move on up, they would implement some actions. We would monitor those actions to see if they did it on time, the success they had, and the outcomes that they got. And then we would say, well, you got it or you didn't get it. And then we'd adjust the actions. And then we did, so that would be the adaptation part, number 11. And then we would start all over again through the cycle. What we're suggesting to you is that that's not complete. And so long as we continue to do that, no matter how hard we try, we're not going to be successful. And that is because we are not including the social part of the ecological system. Now you can see every time that you see the participate cycle, that's that social part in this whole management scheme. So the vision for the forest gets designed through your social interactions and developing consensus. It is through that process that the problem or the project is decided, or in the case that Michael and I are talking to you about, a plan is identified and begun to be developed. But in each step that we, as the leaders, move, we continually are looping back and continuing to make sure that we're never losing track of what the public, of what the social landscape is telling us and their reaction to what we're telling them. It's a continuous communication process. It's that communication process with the social landscape that in fact begins to inform us about what the inventories and the analysis should actually look like. It's not us telling them. We, as the experts, are being hired by them to provide expert advice, and we will. But as you'll see next week when Michael and I talk, you'll see that we don't tell people what to do at all. It's not our job to tell you what to do. We try to help you better understand what it is you want to do, what you need to do, and to help better express to you either the mechanisms through planning or the science and the technologies that you need to achieve the outcomes, the socially based ecological outcomes that you're looking for. But you can see all through this process, there are all these feedback loops back into the social system and always going back into the original vision for the forest that the citizens groups provide. Again, even the selection of what gets done, and then finally the monitoring and the evaluation of the programs and the actions. This, my friends, is a very scary thing for most agencies and for most companies to do, to invite transparency and to invite people to take a look at what you're doing, and to not only take a look at it, but to participate into creating the agenda and transforming agendas and transforming budgets. But this is what it's all about. This is how we believe it has to be, and this is what we have found success with. It's very frightening when we walk into a government to do that, but it works. And we have found that it works. And so we're going to stop there. I just wanted to put this last up too. Next week, we will go step by step in detail about how to do all of this. Not only just in this framework, this is a framework that came from Morris Arboretum many years ago, but we will provide you that and the case study information to help you better understand how to move through this entire process. Finally, I do want to say that, again, we're really excited about being here with the Arboricultural Association in the UK. We think that they're spot on with what they're doing with these webinars, sharing, exchanging information. And Michael and I would like to do that with you. So please, here's our email address. If you have questions or you have projects that you're involved in, or you just like to open a dialogue with us, we welcome that. So thanks a bunch, and I'm going to turn it over to John and answer some questions, I hope.
Absolutely wonderful. Again, thank you guys. Lots for everybody to think about. Lots and lots to think about. Some, I'm sure you've been too busy presenting and speaking to look at the chat, but there's been some great conversation again in the chat. Some good questions coming in here as well. There's a couple of debates have been raging in the chat, let's say, and one of the issues I think has been nicely summed up by Isabella. Isabella just saying that in Brazil, what arboriculturalists want regarding ecosystem services is not necessarily the same as what residents want, because the residents worry more about the possible disservices from tree failure, for example. So there's a serious communication conflict between stakeholders, and that's been backed up from another part of the world, Andy, who is, I think, in Hong Kong, talking about education for people being very important, because the residents have this negative perception often of trees, whereas the professionals see it differently. So I guess one question, I suppose, is how do you go about bridging that gap? And I suppose I'm interested in what sort of weighting do you give to the opinions of the public, I suppose, and the knowledge of the professionals, if I can put it like that.
Michael, I'll take a crack at that first.
Okay.
There was we can unpack those statements into many questions, really. First off, if for Isabel, and hi, how you doing? Sorry you didn't get down there a couple of years ago, but risk is a perception, of course, that's very personal for people. Arborists can only give their technical expression of levels of risk, but there is no real certainty, particularly in urban areas. I was just talking with Andreu, who's an expert in risk, a little while ago, and he says it's tough to ever tell anybody that a tree is better than moderately risky anytime. So when they use the techniques that ISA provides, the other thing is that when we see that the social landscape suggests that there are a preponderance of people who are frightened by trees, and Michael and I deal with that quite a lot, by the way, here in Florida, because we get hurricanes quite a bit, then that's just an indication that that's where the effort has to be. The effort has to be in really taking a look at that. Is that risk real? What are the levels of risk that we can express through science? And then providing that to people. But if people can't accept the science, and science is not infallible, it's models, then we have to accept that, and we have to work with that. But seeing that, it's just like the fellow last week who asked me, well, what happens if nobody wants trees? And we've seen that. Michael mentioned up in Detroit, we'd seen evidence where they tried to plant trees and people didn't want them. Then that just is an indication of where your program needs to go. So, and I'm sorry, what was the statement from Hong Kong?
Just the fact that I've lost us now. The fact that, again, really sometimes residents have a perception of trees, a similar sort of thing, that's from a different part of the world. Residents have a perception of trees as being dangerous. Elizabeth's also said people often people often worry about the damage from roots and falling branches and leaves and flowers making the pavement slippery. It's all the sort of complaints that I think that the tree officers in the UK are very familiar with. It's the old "I love trees, but" that we all hear so much, and it's just, I suppose, how we bridge that gap of education and communication.
Well, and I think we all have to realize, without sounding redundant, is that we are in the Anthropocene epoch, and one of the really difficult troubles that we have to address today is that there are large portions of our population who do not necessarily see wild nature as being necessary.
Yeah.
So not everybody even sees that. So that's a big hurdle for us all to jump as conservationists.
And I guess sorry, Michael, but that's like a vicious circle, I suppose, as well, isn't it? Because there's a disconnect between people and nature, so they don't appreciate nature so much and they don't want it. And then if they get their way, almost, that just widens that gap and it gets worse and it keeps going down. It's got to break that cycle somehow.
Well, in our economic systems, we see things as objects. That's what Michael and I are trying to say. They're not objects, right? We see things as objects that have an economic price tag. And if it's in the way of another object that has a bigger economic dollar value, it goes. Okay? We see things as objects, and we can't continue to do that. And also, we have to realize that here in my country, we have 81% of the population live in urban areas. Okay? They see these things as objects. They think that the natural resources are inexhaustible and renewable, and that they can just use them willy-nilly and use them up. And we've got this cycle, and we have 81% in my country of people living in urban areas. I don't know what the percentage is of them, but there's a large chunk of them that are second, third, and fourth generation urban people, and they don't relate to non-urban wild nature at all. And they have a rather autistic relationship with the natural or wild world. And that's a big hurdle for us to overcome. Michael, I'm talking too much.
That's all right. I sort of have a little slightly different perspective on this, and that's, I think obviously one answer to the question of how do you deal with this is that there's a need for education, right? And so that's the academic answer. And certainly in areas where specific species, we don't have the information about them, that's a need for research. We need to learn more about those. And so I think that's the standard answer that we say is, well, we need to educate these folks. But that is the standard answer. We've been saying that answer over and over again for decades, and so, a book I read a little while ago, I think I've talked to you about it, Rob, but it's one by a guy named Randy Olson. And I thought it was great. I read it, and the title of the book was "Don't Be Such a Scientist." And the idea was that this guy, we've been having these conversations over and over again. He was talking about it in reference to climate change and how people didn't get it, and how we needed to educate people about it. And he was a big academic at a major university in the U.S. and he dropped out. And he said, I'm tired of keeping on repeating that mantra. And he dropped out and he went to Hollywood to learn about how to tell the story. And I think that goes back to a lot of what our problems are, is that we don't do a good job of communicating these values, these services, and the disservices, and recognizing the disservices that trees provide and acknowledging those things. and how we communicate those things. And you know, Rob, you talked about the artists and the value that they bring to the table, and that's so true. And I think, you know, part of our problem is that we think just giving information alone is going to be enough. And for me, that is often all I need to get it. I need some facts, I need some information. But it's that context that that information lies within that is often not there. And so there needs to be an element of storytelling. And that's what artists bring to it, whether it's through song or whether it's through imagery, and getting you to think about things in a different way, sort of twisting your perception. And that's, I think, something that's important for us as professionals to sort of learn anew, is how to tell stories, how to communicate these issues and acknowledge their concerns and not just dismiss them. So that's
Michael, I think also it has to do with the fact that people do not feel like they have the power to engage in the collaborative process. Or maybe a collaborative process doesn't even exist in some cities, and people just don't feel like, well, you know, why bother? You know, the experts make the decisions. They seem to be controlled. Remember, I mentioned earlier that we really have to watch ourselves, really watch ourselves, you know, and don't get into a rut. Don't believe that you have like all the answers to everything, you know, in your profession or in your little group. We are often the ones who inhibit creativity because we define ourselves within our professional perspectives.
The comment about including artists and everything, I think, is really important, and certainly struck a chord with some of our viewers. Nice comment from Lottie here saying, Rob, I love that you say include artists in everything you do. I'm a landscape architect, but also an illustrator. I've been thinking about what artists and scientists can mean for each other for a while now, especially when it comes to promoting urban forestry. And I'd love to work with scientists to visualize data in an inspiring way to inspire people on another level. I think that's something we've touched on quite a lot through the webinars, where it's these new approaches, isn't it? Art, music, these different kinds of sort of languages and communication tools to get our message across.
Yeah, I mean, the artists, what they convey, you know, the visual artists, the musicians, you can't even put it, they don't even have words for the way that you can feel when you encounter those types of things. And that's where most people live. You know, they don't live in this scientific perspective. The scientific method and what it brings is it brings a bit of impartiality, and it can act as a place where people can come together and agree. But it's not always very inspiring.
I think if anyone's interested in the meeting of art and science, then the webinar we did a couple of weeks ago, Mesopotamia, with Lucia Montecchio, Giorgio Gobbo, and Nev Fay, it's on YouTube. It was a bit different and a bit weird, and it was absolutely brilliant. So that's a bit of music with your trees as well. Okay. We've got so many questions and so many comments and so little time, it's kind of difficult to know where to go. But Naomi, if I don't mention Naomi, I really will be in trouble, because as ever, Naomi is stealing the show on the chat and the questions. Naomi, thank you so much, as ever. Naomi's made a point about these social surveys and asked, in order to incorporate all of your citizens in the approach to urban forest planning and management, how are you sharing knowledge in an accessible and approachable way so that contributions from everyone are informed contributions? I suppose this goes back to this idea of people almost giving you the answer you don't want. Do you educate them first and then engage, or is it just free for them to go what they want?
Well, I think that goes back to the thing that we mentioned earlier, is that you start someplace. Right? You start someplace, but continuing to monitor the social landscape is an unending thing. So there is no thing that you do to do it. You begin to do it, and you don't stop. So, for instance, we working with the city of Gainesville right now in Florida, and finishing up with them. And one of the things that they've already mentioned that they are going to do for sure is to continue to monitor every 5 years the biophysical urban forest, but also to monitor the social landscape as well. So it's going to be a continuous process, because I know that they're also going to have education programs, and they're going to have probably some PR work going on. So, so we don't, it's not a matter of trying to tell them what it is. It's a matter of trying to get feedback from them about, mostly about how they feel, right? Mostly about how they feel. Those values, extremely important, at least in our government structure, because those values are what the political body responds to. And so if you understand that, then that's a set of information that you have as a manager who works for the political body, or as a planner like Michael and I working for a political body, to better understand how to approach things. So, but we don't tell them, it's not a training and then say, well, did you learn it? Right? It's a continuous process. It's a monitoring. And we'll get into that in more detail next week.
I'd just like to add is that, one of the things that as we've done these surveys is that they're imperfect, we found, and we're missing things. But that's the management mantra, right? You lack information, you don't have all the information you need, you don't have the time you need, you don't have all the resources you need, and yet you have to move forward and make decisions because time doesn't stop. And it's the same thing in the context of these social surveys. While we would love to be able to say we got everybody's opinion included, and which that certainly might be the goal, it's invariably not going to happen, and certainly probably not your first time out. And so I think you continue to make the commitment to trying to improve that understanding and engage more people over time, because it becomes a continuous conversation. Hopefully it will evolve, and you'll find techniques that work better to achieve to get to audiences that maybe you were missing previously. But in the meantime, you do go forward with the information you have. And I think we can't just stop and say until we get everybody in. It's not, we can't do anything. I think we have to always keep moving forward.
Hey, I want to say, Naomi, I just saw your chat. I don't normally look at the chat, but I saw it kind of pop up. So sorry, I misunderstood Naomi's question. Naomi was asking, do we provide the basic information about trees, how they grow, and fundamental knowledge that's helpful in continuing the dialogue? And I would say, Naomi, when Michael and I have gone into a city to help them develop an urban forest management plan, we do these different forms of social surveys, focus groups, nominal sessions, big formal surveys, and some of these different internal government SWOT analysis. So we do not initially provide information about the functioning of the forest and how it all happens. But we wind up doing that as we're going through the process of helping them develop the urban forest management plan, is invariably providing workshops like that for people to attend and to better learn the biophysical part of managing the urban forest, because that is a piece of information and knowledge that most people don't have. Thanks, Naomi.
I can only apologize for misreading the question. Blame me anyway. Blame me, not Naomi or Rob. Oh, someone spotted the cone on the bookshelf. We're going to be playing What's That Cone at the end of the show. Please don't tune out just yet. Okay, there's so many different angles for us to go on. But there's been a couple of really interesting questions here. Now, the first one from an anonymous attendee. Please declare yourselves. It's really interesting to hear who you are and what you're thinking. But our anonymous attendee, unless that's actually your name, which must be difficult in day-to-day life, this approach is brilliant but slow. when the science is telling us we have about 10 years to avoid environmental catastrophe? Shouldn't we be more bullish? And I sort of follow that up with a question from Anne, which is how long until this whole process comes to fruition? Education, involvement, achieving a result we're all happy with. I guess it's an ongoing process. And I know, Rob, that you always say it's a sort of never-ending conversation. But can we accept that at a time when we're facing environmental catastrophe? Have we got time to be nice to people and ask their opinions? Should we not just go ahead and crack on?
Well, I'll just start off with saying, again, we've sort of taken that approach and trying to just do what we see as the right thing, as the experts, and it fails. And so it's not working to just simply say, I got the answers. This body of professionals has the answers, and listen to us, trust us. We've demonstrated repeatedly that doesn't work out. And so, yes, this is a slow process. This does not happen instantaneously. This is a matter of building relationships and that collaboration that we talked about. But is it sustainable? Is it going to work for the long haul? We believe that yes. The answer is, resoundingly yes. And we all, we all feel that sense of urgency. And again, that's sort of what we as managers feel like we need to do. But if we're doing and then it's going nowhere, we're wasting more time. And so it's really better to establish those foundational relationships and hear that so that in the long haul you get the outcomes you really want. That's my thoughts.
And Michael, I want to say first off that what we're suggesting to you is a framework which we'll flesh out in much greater detail next Wednesday. But that same framework can be used at different scales of organization, of conservation work. We're talking about urban right now, but I hope that you saw the first program we looked at, because in that program, I told you that we think the entire peninsula of Florida is an urban forest. We think the entire forest of Peninsula Florida is urban because it is the urban people, their values, their social norms, and their economic drivers that are determining how that forest is and isn't being managed over time. So we use urban forest. Perhaps we need another term to mean the forests of the world in the Anthropocene. So if you use this framework at a larger scale, you obviously can affect much bigger geographic scales of forest and not just what's in the city. And Michael and I are suggesting, that's why we're talking about ecological processes and ecosystems. So ecosystem approach is we're not looking at the city by itself. We're looking at the city as being one component of the forest ecosystem. And we're talking about managing the entire urban forest. So when we're talking about managing an urban forest, we're looking at thousands of square kilometers at a time. So yes, it is slow, it is incremental, but if you pump it up to larger scales, you will get the benefit of bumping it up to that larger scale, and you will get change. And what we're talking about is real change. What Michael and I are seeing is that in the instances that we've worked with governments with this process, that in every instance, they've taken what they've gotten out of this and they have incorporated it in totality into the fundamental legal doctrine from which all other laws and ordinances spring within that jurisdiction. And that's not going to go away, because that's a fundamental change.
You mentioned the framework a couple of times there, and there's one question here, hopefully quite a quick one, from Lee, just saying, could you repeat the name or the acronym of the framework that you use?
There is no name or acronym.
Okay. It is anonymous attendee.
Sorry, there's no name for that.
No
it's just
problem.
it's an adaptive It's an adaptive management cycle is what it's showing. An adaptive management cycle. That might have been what I said.
Okay. Okay, so another question that I like. Lots of questions that I like. A question from Nakul. This is a bit more maybe a philosophical question. If the health of a forest, it says forest, but we're going to go urban forest, I guess. If the health of a forest may be poor due to natural factors, in such cases, should there be human intervention? If it's a natural problem that the forests have got, then should we be intervening? And maybe you can lead on from that to give us your definition of natural in an urban environment that you've been deliberately trying to avoid for the last hour and a half.
Michael, you want to go with that?
Started last time, you go for it.
People are part of the world, of the ecosystems that make up the planet. We are not apart from it. And there is no part on this planet, as the scientists have readily told us over and over again recently, especially with our ability to look at all the systems of the planet at one time, in which what we do in one portion of the planet cannot invariably have an effect on another part. So I think what you have to really think about is what is the outcome that you're looking for, and to act accordingly. So can people intervene? Absolutely. Is it philosophically or ethically correct for them to intervene? I think absolutely it is ethically correct to intervene. So
I think this goes to this idea of restoration. And you know, so when we look at ecosystems that are have changed, been altered for a variety of reasons, and trying to restore them back to some condition that they were prior, I think one of the questions that we need to, one, recognize is that that is a management action. That is not, you're not doing some work of the angels. You are actually making a management decision, a people decision there, that's a desired outcome or state that you want to get back to. And so there's nothing wrong with that if that's what has been decided to do, but recognize that, and it's going to take action, involvement of people to often do that, to restore that ecosystem back. And then the real question comes is, once you have it back into that condition, that state, that function that you've described and defined as desirable, then how do you maintain it there? And so that's going to continue to require a long-term commitment, especially when we're talking about many ecosystems that occur within that broader urbanization matrix. And I think of in Florida here, some of our longleaf pine ecosystems, and we can spend a lot of money, time, and effort restoring these sites back, getting the species mix back, getting the fire, reintroducing fire into those ecosystems, and then in the interim, they've been developed around, and that creates new challenges. And so the sustainability of being able to maintain that ecosystem on the landscape is increasingly challenging. So from a philosophical question, you have to ask yourself, is that the right system to put back, given that the whole matrix and the landscape has been altered? And are you just holding on to a patch for your own personal desires, or are you actually creating a functioning ecosystem there? And I think those are difficult questions to ask.
Yeah, I think so, Michael. And I think we have to be careful about how and Michael has been in his description of what restoration is. Restoration is not restoration of a previous system. Nature and those communities and systems are not in some balance that we know all the parts and we can just put them all back. They are contingent on history, availability, on changes in climate, soil formation, hydrology, all these things. And so when we go into doing restoration, what we are really doing is we are having a human perception about what it is we want in the end, and then we are restoring it to do that. So in reality, restoration is an ecological approach to the management of whatever particular system you're looking at. Because rather than looking at it as objects, you're going back into it and deliberately paying attention to all the relationships between the parts that you are putting back, and hoping that you get a good reciprocal relationships going, that in the end, this new system is sustainable.
Yeah, it's interesting when people talk about the natural landscape. It's not always very natural, the thing they think they're talking about.
I'm going to answer that question for you right now, since you asked me about what natural is. I never use that word. That's my answer. When I would teach, I don't like to use the word natural. It's just loaded. It's full of that assumption that people are not part of the biosphere. It's loaded with that idea that things are in some type of balance. And so I avoid it.
Yeah, so it's less a criticism of the fact that something isn't, maybe a tree in a city isn't natural to be there, and more to do with the fact that it sets humanity outside of the bounds of natural. So everything is natural because we're part of that system.
That's right. That's right.
Look at that. Come for the trees, stay for the philosophy. You can all give this some thought at home. So somebody who is listening last week is Joe, who says, hello from Antarctica. I'm not sure if I believe you or not, Joe, but I'm going to take it, and I'm counting it, and that is good enough for me. But someone else...
We got all the continents this time.
All the continents, we're done. We can just go home. Someone else who was listening last week is Ian, with quite a specific question. Last week's slides indicated that wetlands and mangroves yield high, but not the highest, levels of ecosystem services. Were these other habitats, like mangroves, included in your sample plot network? And have you had the same traction in achieving recognition of their value when tools like iTree and various science studies are less readily available for those habitats? So I guess the question is kind of, are things like mangroves undervalued in a way because the systems we have to value habitats don't necessarily cover them?
Those models don't even really do a good job of recognizing the values of mangroves. And so, I mean, first off, that's first and foremost. And that's the thing about science, right? And when you start to put these models together and present the outcomes of these models, you have to make sure you put some caveats in there, is that this is just what we feel comfortable as scientists presenting based on the literature that's out there and the work that's been done to date. And in fact, from the first time that we did the inventories of Tampa and used the U4 now iTree models, a number of additional ecosystem services have been added in as outputs from those models. It's not that all of a sudden that area, Tampa area, produced more services than it did when we first did it. It's just that we now feel more comfortable with some of these models in articulating what they're doing. And so, as I'd say all the time, all models are wrong, some are useful. And this is one that is helpful in furthering that conversation about the values that these forests are producing. But is it flawed? By all means, it's flawed. And certainly, a lot of the growth models associated with mangroves are wrong, and they're based off of some trees that are similar in nature to them. And so we've made some inferences there. But does it advance our conversation? Yes, it does. And is it repeatable? Yes, it is. And so, we're trying to use science to have those conversations. So, I guess the question was, did we miss some ecosystems out there and some of the services that were produced by them? Hell yeah, we did. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of services and disservices that we don't have a good handle on and don't communicate very well.
Yeah, and Michael, of course, that's right. I mean, again, we're trying something. All of us are involved in something new here. So there's a lot of experimentation in terms of inventory, in terms of monitoring, and in terms of practice. I do want to answer that question, though, very directly, okay? because I know the graph that they were asking about. And the answer is absolutely yes. We didn't miss the mangroves because EPA, who was our partner with that investigation, that was part of the collaboration. They were actively monitoring mangroves and measuring them. And we actually had experts who were studying mangroves in the southern part of Florida on the team who came up with those numbers. So in that case, they were as good as they could be. Like Mike, it's as good as we could do. But as Michael mentioned, when we do things like with iTree or some other type of methodologies that are not that closely monitored and overseen by scientists, we wind up making some generalizations and missing some things.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions I want to try and cover. Where are we? 22. So we've got a little bit more time. A few people have been asking whether the presentation will be made available online. It will. Last week's presentation is already on YouTube. This week's presentation, we'll get it on there as quickly as possible, hopefully tomorrow if we can. A couple of other people have asked about continuous professional development and certificates of attendance. If you need a certificate of attendance, then please let us know and we can issue one. So any questions, john@trees.org.uk as ever. So Ian, again, you've already had a question, but I'm going to ask this one as well because I really like it. Did the social engagement process produce urban forest plans at the same level of granularity as the social surveys? So would a neighborhood receive a plan that reflected their neighborhood survey? So that's one question. The other question is, how does this work for the central business district of Tampa? Who has the right to choose in non-residential areas? And this is something I found really interesting when I was working in London as well. Lots of parts of London, people don't really live there. They just work there. So when you're doing a survey, who do you go to? Who gets to say what happens there?
That's an excellent question. And certainly one we've had to address is that in a city, there are many people who commute in and work, and then at the end of the day, they leave. But they may in fact also be property owners. And how do you engage them? And the way that we have attempted to do that, not foolproof, right? Attempted to do that is that when you have public planning committees, and we're going to get into this in much more detail next Wednesday, okay, is that you ensure that the business community is in there too, that they get to have something to say, that they're not left out. And when we make the social surveys online available, you simply have to be somebody there in town who's old enough to do this responsibly. And we ask for people's backgrounds. So it is a bit difficult to get, but when we get down to those business districts, that's where the government, the public institutions have much more to say about what's going to go on because it's so densely built, right? And so it's through their agencies that decisions are made about trees. In this case, we're just planting trees, sometimes in pits, to provide some shade. Michael, you have something?
Well, I'd say, and we also, there's a couple pieces to this. One is you got to be careful how you subset a survey, and I'll talk more about the biophysical aspects of it. So often when we do look at our work, we do at the citywide scale. We have these plots set up throughout, and people will say, well, can you tell me about this one area? Can you just look at those? And the sample size is too small. So you got to be really careful about subsetting off a sample and then making inferences about a given area if your sample is poor. And so, if you've designed a survey that's supposed to be describing this broader area, it's dangerous to work at a smaller granularity as the question was. I will say, one of the things like the approach we've taken in Gainesville with the management plan that we're developing for them or helping them develop, is to look at things by land use category. And so these different land use categories have different goals and objectives set up for them, whether how much canopy cover they want to have in them or not, for example, or how much, diversity, what kind of diversity, or what kind of functionality they want those trees to provide in terms of rainfall interception and things like that. So these goals and objectives are stated at a land use level, but everybody is part of that city, and just regardless of the fact that they don't live in those areas, they still have a reason to want to be part of the discussion of the goals and objectives in that area. And so I think that's how we've approached it as well, is to make sure that all can still have a say, even though they may not live in a given part of that city.
But also, again, going back to Tampa and to Gainesville, in their urban forest management plan is the recognition and the acceptance that as part of the social landscape of understanding the landscape, they are actually going to now conduct like focus groups and nominal group sessions at neighborhood levels. As a matter of fact, the city of Gainesville has in its plan is that their next iteration of maturation, if you will, of the urban forest plan is to actually seek the input at the neighborhood level, so that when they go to work in the public realm within different neighborhoods, that they will actually change their management practices if need be to reflect the attitudes and the perspectives of the people who live there.
That's right, but they're taking a finer grain on that sample size, right?
That's right. Oh, it's changed. Well, now instead of a big survey, they're going to have focus groups, and they're going to get together with community leaders.
Okay, we've got a couple of Matt's tried to make a comment now. Matt in Santa Monica, who used to be in Stonehouse, but for reasons best known to himself, decided he was going to go to Santa Monica. I can't explain it. Matt's saying that urban forest plans need to be neighborhood specific, so sort of 100,000 people, so the community can relate to them and the intentions, rather than, I suppose, having a much wider area applied to everybody.
And I think that's true, and that's what Michael and I are saying is, like, the first cut for us, first off, we go in and we help governments create urban forest management plans. Well, the first thing is to recognize that you're helping a government create an urban forest management plan. We didn't go in to work with neighborhoods to help them. What we do is we go at that bigger scale with the government, and then we tell them, say, look, if you want to manage this thing ecologically, you have to begin to break this down and not see your city as one big homogeneous area, but as being separate and separate in terms of the biophysical and separate in terms of the social landscape also. So good point.
And anything for you, Michael, on that one, or?
No.
You okay? Okay, so one last question I was going to ask. It's Naomi again, but I think it's worth asking. Do you ever think about incorporating the question, what does the tree need in order to deliver all the things we want? And I don't think Naomi's necessarily thinking about just the standard thoughts behind tree planting, but what can we do for the tree as well as what can the tree do for us?
Well, go ahead, Michael.
Well, I just say from an explicit standpoint, that is not part of the existing planning process. It's not to say that it's not a valid question to ask, but it currently, as we design these plans, we haven't put that explicitly into the planning process.
I don't know, Michael. I think it's inherent. It seems like that's all that they've been doing. Most of the people we deal with is trying to give the tree what it wants, and they're not necessarily doing a good job at it. But I mean, we've got all this information about how much soil it needs, how much space. Next Tuesday, Deb and I are going to come on, tell you how far away from the infrastructure it has to be, and things like that. So I think inherent. It is in there. I know the management plans that we write, for instance, the last one we've been working on, actually the city is agreed that primarily they're going to use native trees, and that we've created an entire matrix that describes the habitat needs of those trees, including soil amount, space from that, pH, salt, water, everything, right? And so that when they plant a tree from now on, when the public plants a tree, if they've got a space, they go through a matrix and they sift through it and they figure out which tree can make it there, which tree can survive, so that they do it in an efficient and an effective manner, and so that it meets Michael's criteria of having that temporal scale of ensuring that the tree, no matter what it is going to live a long life and produce the greatest amount of benefit for society in that urban setting. Because as we all know, the older the tree gets, the bigger the canopy, the more likely we get to get a bigger bang for the buck. So I think it's in there.
Well, I'd say this is philosophical, but I'd say one thing that, about biology is that, one of the major goals of all living things is to reproduce. And I'd say, so the need of the biological entity to pass on its genetic material. And I don't know that in these plans, we think a lot about the natural reproduction of these trees within the urban matrix. I don't know that we talk about that or think about that or include that as part of the process. And so that's a pretty darn fundamental part of of asking the question, what does the tree need? I mean, I assume that would be something the tree might express it needs and or desires. And I don't know that we talk about that. So I mean, I think I'm not discounting what you said, Rob, at all, but I think there's also aspects that we don't include.
We certainly don't shy away from the philosophical side here. That it's the meeting of art and science and philosophy. Okay.
Hey, let me make one comment, because I saw Naomi's comment. Naomi, if you send me an email, I'll send you the tree matrix that we provide with the cities and discuss how they perform mitigation and have changed their tree planting program to truly try to fit the tree with the site, or the site with the tree. And of course, in urban areas, as Isabel points out, it's often difficult because, in the densely packed areas. So, but that's a whole nother conversation about how to redesign the built infrastructure to allow trees to be there. John?
Just as one quick closing comment, Anthony, thank you again, as always. A great, I think, approach to what we've been talking about, trying to convince people. It's not easy to get over what it took me a lifetime to appreciate in a few minutes conversation, especially if the person is disinclined to listen. It's a tough thing. It's a tough challenge we've got, but it's certainly worth it. Just about 2 minutes ago, Michael mentioned reproduction, which I was poised to use as a fantastic segue to the next exciting installment of Guess That Cone. But then we had more conversation and the segue was lost. But it was a great broadcasting moment, and we'll probably edit it down to make it look like I was really good there. Michael, Guess That Cone.
This is a big one, huh? Another one. This is a sugar pine from Mountain, California. So the cone from that beautiful big.
And where's it from, Michael?
California. This is I had to, when I went out there, I had to go find one of these stands and collect these. I got a whole box. So awesome.
Well, we had a couple of correct guesses for sugar pine. We have got a very knowledgeable audience. I'm trying to scroll down now properly, because the first person to guess sugar pine was Shane, but Shane only sent his guess to all panelists. So as far as everyone else is concerned, you lose. I do try and warn you all the time. So Riley was the first person to get it right. Martin also got it right, but has already admitted it was a fluke. So thank you for your honesty, Martin. Can't wait to see what's produced next week. Gents, I don't know if you want to give a very quick summary, as we did last week, just a 30 seconds, a minute about today, and then maybe looking ahead to next week as well before we finish up completely.
Well, what we gave you this morning this afternoon or this evening, depending upon where you are, was that little brief introduction to an contemporary ecological perspective of ecosystems that serve as the foundation for all of the work that we do and that you do too. And a brief glimpse at the need for biophysical and the social landscape to be understood, and that framework for adaptive management. And we're going to take all of that together next week and use Tampa and Gainesville and Hillsborough County as case studies and show you just exactly how we did become successful at doing it. And also we're going to show you how we bumped our nose against the wall a few times too, trying to get it done. Michael?
No, I think that's it. I think we've shown you a case study. Sort of tried it that first time, tried to tell you a big picture of what can be, and then we're going to talk today about sort of the broad theory of this, and then we're really going to get into the nitty gritty of how to do it.
Real detail. The next time is the detail.
And put it into action.
Well, thank you so much. It was another great session. I'm really looking forward to it next week. We've got quite a few people saying in the chat, can we have a copy of the matrix you've spoken about? I'm sure, again, if you want to email me, john@trees.org.uk, or Rob and Michael have made their emails available. Rob?
Yeah, either way, John, I'll send you a copy. And that way, however, but I'd love to hear from people. So, please.
We can send you both Tampa's and Gainesville's.
Right. We can explain how they're being used.
Yeah, I mean, we keep saying, and we really mean it, this whole thing is a conversation. We want to engage as many people as possible. The chat's been amazing again. Thank you all so much. You're all brilliant. I really appreciate you taking the time. Michael and Rob, it's an absolute privilege to be involved in all this. Thank you so much. Apologies to everyone whose comments I couldn't read out. Please sign up for next Tuesday, University of Florida event, but we're helping host that. And please, of course, sign up for next Wednesday. And hopefully we'll see you all next week. So stay safe, look after each other, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.